Thanks, everybody, for having us. We're going to get started. We have a distinguished panel, and I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves because they can do their intros far better than I can. So we'll start with Daniel Gorfine.
Great, thank you. Good to be here. So I'm Daniel Gorfine. I was most recently with the CFTC, and I'm very used to giving my standard government disclaimer, but now I realize I'd just be disclaiming myself, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So at the CFTC, I was Chief Innovation Officer and Director of Lab CFTC. For those of you who don't know much about Lab CFTC, it was the agency's FinTech and innovation program and initiative. It had a dual mandate, large external engagement function as well as an internal function. Externally, Lab CFTC spends a lot of time meeting with innovators across the country to try to provide some feedback and high-level guideposts, and then take that information and internalize it at the agency to make sure that the agency has the right understanding and tools to keep pace with changing markets. By backing up a little bit, though, in terms of my background, I'm an attorney. I started my career at a law firm in Washington, D.C. I then had a chance to build out one of the first fintech policy programs at a think tank in Washington that was grappling with kind of the impact of the internet, early days, impact of the internet on financial markets and services, and starting to think a little bit about things like crowdfunding and online lending and robo-advisory, online payments or digital payments, and early days certainly of cryptocurrencies. From there, I had the chance to lead external and regulatory affairs at a leading US fintech lending company that went public back in 2014, and obviously then had the opportunity to serve at the CFTC. I left the CFTC about 6 weeks ago. I've launched my own boutique advisory, fintech and regtech advisory business, and I'm still an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law School where I teach fintech law and policy. So glad to be with you all.
Great. Thank you for that. Amy?
Well, that's a hard act to follow. So I'm Amy Kim. I lead the policy work at the Chamber of Digital Commerce. We are a blockchain technology trade association, 5 years old. We have over 200 members spanning the entire blockchain industry, so financial services as well as non-financial services applications. So we get a really neat perspective. And we advocate both in Congress and in the agencies. And so it's a pretty busy time. My background is as a lawyer in private practice, focusing on cross-border compliance programs, so U.S. sanctions, anti-money laundering, trade, and investment type programs. So glad to be here with you all.
Great. Thanks. Tina?
I'm Tina Baker-Taylor. I am the Executive Director of Global Digital Finance again. I already explained kind of what GDF does. My background is in banking, predominantly transaction banking. So before getting involved in the digital asset space more specifically, I worked on a number of blockchain initiatives to digitize supply chain finance, and capital market trade settlement. So I have a finance background, as I think a lot of people in this space do. But today working with regulators and the industry in a collaborative fashion to help to progress standards both for conduct and operation, and to hopefully bring a bit more clarity to the space that we're all trying to innovate in.
Great. And last but not least, David.
Yeah, just start oldest that's relevant forward. Ran the top 10 equity capital markets group in the street, priced 1,000 public equity offerings, pioneered Form S3 shelf registrations, which led to registered directs and things. Ran the investment bank. I was then the head of their .com businesses. Followed my mentor was Wick Simmons over to NASDAQ, where I became vice chairman of NASDAQ, running the listings businesses, got to interact with luminaries, including Steve Jobs and Craig Barrett, who ran Intel at the time. Steve Ballmer ran Microsoft, was a lot of fun. Howard Schultz. And then left and started writing about what I saw were problems with market structure. That led to the Jobs Act and the FAST Act and some of the current discussion that Hester Pierce said the SEC is seeking comment on. I sit on the boards of a number of companies in crypto, blockchain, mostly exchange-related space that are actually going through the front door of regulation. including one that has a Form F1 that's INX that's at the SEC, and been through 20 months worth of comments at this point, and I think that's most of what's relevant.
Fantastic. So as you can see, we have a great panel, and we're definitely going to save time for questions from the audience. I'm going to start with just a few questions. We're going to engage in a little back and forth here. So to start, let's start with David. Talk to us about your experience working with both regulators and innovators here in the cryptocurrency space.
So I neglected to say, Wield & Co. is an investment bank that we're pushing in the cloud. We're in 17 states in the District of Columbia right now trying to fill the void in the middle market. We have people doing blockchain transactions. We just got through an SEC audit, and they pulled every OBA, outside business activity, and anything related to crypto and blockchain to take a look at. Interestingly, we ended up with 0 comments on any of it, so we feel very good about that. That was their hot button. But we believe that you have to embrace regulation. And 3 months before, SEC Chair Jay Clayton came out and said that he hadn't seen an ICO that he didn't think was a securities offering, we had basically told all of our bankers that we were going to treat them all as securities offerings. At the end of the day, the regulators win, and it's a very, I think, constipated process sometimes, but everybody that we work with shares our view that you want to engage with the regulators, you want to treat them to the extent that you can as your partners, and that collaboration is absolutely key to long-term success. And so our broker-dealer is actually out in Colorado, and the district office of FINRA is in Denver Tech Center. And we are probably one of the only broker-dealers that actually makes a point when I'm in town to go visit the regulators and say hi. It's critical.
That's great. Tina?
I think the point that David just mentioned around spending time with the regulators in your jurisdiction is imperative. So, there's a number of opportunities to do so. And different jurisdictions are obviously either more open or more experienced in bringing industry in to have those more personal relationships. But in my experience, oftentimes there is this resistance to engage because there's a fear of enforcement. And I don't think that until very recently, regulators haven't been taking any enforcement. If anything, they've been saying, we're going to kind of wait and see. Constipated is an interesting word. I think that there is my analog is the kind of parasympathetic response to, a something. So there's that fight, flight, or freeze. And I kind of put regulators into some of those boxes where some of them would just appear to be frozen and unable to kind of kickstart more progressive discussions. So I think that is critical. The other thing that I always remind industry of is regulators can only regulate what they have a mandate to regulate. And so that's where firms like the Digital Chamber come in, helping to kind of push forward what that legislative framework should be to give some of those regulators the power to do that. So I live in London, and right now we're going through a consultation with Parliament to decide if the regulatory perimeter should be extended to the FCA to do this or that. And a lot of people get very frustrated with the FCA because there seems to be this, collaborative, innovation-friendly hub, and yet they haven't taken some action around certain areas of regulatory perimeter. They legally can't do so. And so I think that there is the regulatory advocacy piece, but there is also a very important legislative piece that I don't think we talk about enough, and we blame the regulators for not doing more.
That's great. That's really well done. Good points. Amy?
Yeah, I think you guys have said a lot of the key pieces to it. I mean, the thing that I would just kind of fill in a little bit is regulators are smart people, but they only know what they know. And if industry is not going in to educate and inform of what's actually happening in the industry, they can't make better decisions. in the regulatory space over the things that they do have authority over. So, we're constantly encouraging our members, for example, sometimes maybe with legal counsel, so but, to make sure that you do kind of share how these, because we're asked, we need to know more. How are these digital assets being used? How are they being operationalized? So that we can kind of think ahead, because they do realize that they are slow moving.
And some of those questions are big ones, and some of the questions are, to us, they seem like remedial. I mean, let's just be honest. So I've had a conversation very recently around custody and going round and round and round with what level of control a particular type of custodian may or may not have, whether it's a hard wallet, a soft wallet, and if you have you're a full custodian, do they have a full level of control? And the regulator that I was speaking to was saying, well, if you have the private key, then you have control. And so, the tech guys in the room they keep explaining how this is not the case.
The SEC?
I'm not going to tell you. So the tech guys in the room are trying to explain this, and I understand what they're saying, but clearly the policymakers in the room did not, because they're not technical experts. And so it literally came down to, you walk into a Citibank branch, you have a bag of jewels, you want to put them in a safe deposit box, you go in a back room, you stick them in there, you lock the key, and you go. Does Citibank have full control over your jewels? No, but they do have complete custody of them, right? And so I think that there is a need to educate, but also to be able to put it into context, and that's a thing that I don't think we do as well as we could.
Okay. And Daniel, you have the former regulator experience, so why don't you give us that perspective of sitting on the other side?
Yeah, so look, I agree with a lot of the comments that were made, and just remember this, regulators, by and large, are trying to get it right, okay? And it's really difficult, it's really challenging, because when you're dealing with technology that's very fast moving, the world is changing in a very dynamic way. So what you think is true on day one may not look the same, and all of you that are involved in this space know that that's the case. I mean, the world has changed dramatically even in the last 18 months. So it's a lot about, for regulators, it's a lot about striking the right balance, and that's going to be a lot more art than science. Yes, the process can be slow. Sometimes it can feel glacial. But I always think to myself, it's a double-edged sword too. So if the regulator moves too quickly, so let's say that based on the state of digital assets 18 months ago, 24 months ago, you saw a lot of kind of rapid regulatory action, you'd likely be boxing in innovation and not really being sure what regulatory harms you're trying to solve for. So if that had happened too soon, you would have heard a lot of clamoring saying, that was too soon. You've completely boxed in where this world's going, and it's fast changing. Now, at the same time, I completely appreciate that if it's too slow, and if there's too much ambiguity and uncertainty, that can also chill innovation. So it is about striking the right balance. I will say that in terms of, how do you help the regulator, how do you inform the regulator, I think there's two pieces of that. One is this public engagement piece. It's really valuable. The more that folks come in and explain kind of how certain rules and regulations may have an impact on the course or trajectory of an industry, that's really valuable. At the same time, I'm a big believer, especially having done this recently, in pushing regulators to also build the internal tools and capabilities and mindset to be able to keep up. Because it's also not okay for the regulator to say, the world's really fast changing, I'm not a technical expert, I don't really get it, so I'm going to do nothing. That's not appropriate either. So making sure that regulators have the right types of stakeholders, whether they're innovation offices and programs, the right technical expertise in-house, I do think is really important too. So it's a bit of a two-way street there.
Great. So, we heard that you want to have open dialogue with your regulators. That's a good practice. What are some of the other best practices to remain compliant? So, if you get in trouble, you don't have to call, Greg over there and say, hey, get me out of trouble. I don't want to, litigate or have a compliance matter with these regulators.
I mean, I'm happy to kick off, and I would actually say, I really applaud this conference and the focus on compliance. That's not always the most sexy, exciting topic to be bringing up when you're dealing with innovation. But here's the thing. I do really fundamentally believe that building compliance early into any kind of a fintech type company or project ultimately becomes a competitive advantage. So if you do it and do it well at the outset, that's a lot easier than getting 5 years down the road, now having a successful business that's going a bit mainstream, and all of a sudden you look around and say, God, we haven't built any of the internal guts, infrastructure, plumbing, and compliance programs that we actually need to support this business. So I do think that's really important, is to focus on that early. One of the things that I would say don't do is don't look to skirt just because you can, and you can do it in a clever way.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if you are successful and you actually grow to the scale that you're trying to get to, you can't be too cute for too long, and that's probably not going to work. So if your gut's telling you, yeah, I'm really just skirting right now and trying to play this game, it's probably not the best long-term strategy. To the extent that there are rules or regulations that are causing you problems, where there's there's ambiguity, by all means raise it, but have a rationale as to why you're pursuing change. Like, that's another thing that I would definitely recommend. Is it's not enough to come in and be like, the rules never contemplated the internet. Okay, we know that. But what about the rules is chilling you from doing something that could be beneficial? It's going to be good for markets. It's going to be good for consumers. It's going to be good for traders. That story is important if you're trying to actually impact policy.
Good point. David, you want to jump in?
It was sort of made me laugh. You go back, a year ago, and when everybody was debating, this was or maybe 2 years ago, that ICOs, these things were legal, and you pick up the white paper, and just as a disclosure document, there was no information in there. You couldn't even understand what the token was going to give you in terms of rights. And so, apply the principles, right? I mean, this is not a free-for-all, and you can't fleece investors, right? You have to, what are the investor protections, the disclosure requirements, the basic things that underlie all of the body of law that's been developed. You don't have to, you look at anti-money laundering, you don't want to facilitate people doing things that are going to harm the, facilitate terrorism or drug trafficking and so on and so forth. And so, as long as you're guided by the basic principles and you make a good faith effort, I think that most of the time you're going to come out, even when it's ambiguous, you don't get into the trap of what I think some of the attorneys did that legendarily, where you rationalize your way to the conclusion that you want to reach because you're an intelligent person. We want these tokens not to be securities, so we come up with some convoluted analysis about how they're utility tokens. And in point of fact, everybody in the market is speculating on the value. They're looking for a return. And so why shouldn't they be afforded the same protections that are generally afforded through the broad construct of securities regulation? And that's kind of how we approached it, and I think it served us in incredibly good stead, even when the regulation was much less articulated than it is now.
Good points. Did anybody? Tina, you want to jump in?
So arbitrage, whether it's commercial arbitrage, regulatory arbitrage, anytime you're trying to take advantage of a gap in the market or a differentiator, I mean, that in it of itself is not bad, right? But I think that if we go back to the end of 2017, or beginning of 2017, end of 2018, the proliferation of projects that came to market with the sole intention of focusing on that gap that existed around the regulatory space to not raise capital to build a business, but to drive speculation and make money. It just looking at it from the outside, whether you knew anything about it or not, just felt wrong, right? So we're adult, human beings that have a general sense of what's right and what's wrong, right? And so going back to what we were talking about this morning, just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should, right? So I think when we look at something like ICO, I'll just pick up from what David said. I don't think that the mechanism of capital raising for a young growing business that needs an influx of cash to build a platform in it of itself as a concept is a bad idea. I don't. But it had no governance framework at all. There were no guardrails at all. And so, if there were potentially caps on how much money you could raise, let's say it was $2 million, and disclosures had to have X, Y, and Z, and rights were clearly defined, So not a prospectus, but a white paper kind of guideline around, yes, you can raise this $2 million, and this is what you need to do to be able to do that, and then put it in some kind of escrow to build the thing. I think we could potentially see something like an ICO capital raise come back with some guardrails attached to it that actually allows that participation from investors, even at a retail level, that want to, it's like a Kickstarter, it's a souped up Kickstarter that just went crazy, right? And so if you go back to the fundamentals around crowdfunding, again, there was no regulation for that. And so what the community did was then start to drive, what should these guiding principles be? What do we want to be known for? We don't want to implode our new burgeoning market, so we're going to behave like adults. And so the community itself kind of drove that best practice, which led to very balanced regulation. And that market was, small, and different jurisdictions had a lot more of that activity. But that's one of the things we focus on at GDF, and not necessarily to plug GDF, but it is about coming together as a community to decide, do we want to blow ourselves up, or do we actually want to see the promise delivered the digital assets could provide to society and to financial services? And I think we all do. So just stop trying to do stupid stuff. Just stop that.
That's good. It goes to Daniel's point, just more direct.
Well, it's interesting, because, when you ask about compliance, there's different compliance around what? There's different types of compliance, different requirements for compliance, depending on what you're talking about. Is your business triggering AML? And in some cases, I think that was a little more easier question to answer. And then the rules are clear at that point, what you need to do. And there are some gray, there's some judgments to be made. But, when you're talking about ICOs and that, you're really talking about the function of the token. And is that function such that you're triggering, and the activity that you're doing to issue or generate that token, is it such that you're triggering securities laws?
Mm-hmm.
And so once you do trigger it, then the requirements, again, clear around consumer protection. But we're still in that area where, some are clearly, they are securities, or it should have been. I think that, we're seeing to this day enforcement actions that are bringing companies to task for that. But I think that question still remains as, when is a token a security and when is it not? And I think what you're saying, Tina, too, is that these are some valuable, what's happening in the marketplace is serving a valuable purpose. And how do we recognize that? We saw crowdfunding, get recognized through legislative solutions. Are we coming to that point where a legislative solution is necessary to help put some guardrails in, but to allow this new functionality a place to grow?
If you're not starting from the right place and you start going down this road, you start to build up momentum, and so that can be positive momentum, or you can be perpetually generating more reputational risk. And so people ask me all the time, when are institutions coming? We need institutional, investment so that volumes will go up. When are we going to have, a number of things? When are custody solutions going to be better? When? And I think to myself, well, around all of this is a lack of market integrity, and around all of that is a challenge of reputational risk, not just with regulators, but with each other.
Right.
We don't trust each other in
That's
this
good.
trustless space.
So I'm going to stop us here because I promised time for questions from the audience, and I had a lot more questions, but this has been such a riveting conversation. So when you do ask a question, please state your name, organization, and if you have the question for a specific panelist or if it's open, just let us know.
Hi, Alicia from TaxMap here. Bitcoin isn't a security. It's designed, and it was designed as a decentralized, basically, currency. The nature of everything that's happening right now, everybody's defining everything as a security. So you're basically, I think the last panel person, somebody said that you're trying to apply banking towards a white paper. But aren't we here just trying to apply corporate standards towards white papers now?
Is that to a specific panelist, or is that open to anybody?
It's open to everybody.
Okay. Who wants to take a crack at that one?
Look, I think you're making a valid point that there's a lot of focus right now on the securities law framework, and I think that's a result of the ICO mania, right? So that you had this ICO craze or this boom of token offerings, many of which looked like unregistered securities offerings, so there was some enforcement activity, which always will generate a lot of focus. But you are right to say, I mean, when I look at the U.S. landscape, what I think is kind of missing in the policy conversation is that the actual market, if you look on a market cap basis at the existing crypto markets, it's largely a commodity-based market. I mean, Bitcoin, Ether, and no pun intended here, but derivatives of those cryptocurrencies, I think, is 80+% of actual market cap. So I'm going to spin your question a little bit because I think it's an important point to make, which is from a policy perspective, I think one of the major questions that's still outstanding is how do you actually regulate that market, that crypto commodity market, if you will. Currently, as folks in this room know, it's largely a state-based regime that focuses on kind of money transmission laws, not necessarily on capital markets or exchange-based activity, which is actually what's taking place. So I think as we go, and I know one of the questions that Aaron was going to get into is like why does it take so long in the U.S.? Part of it is, there's pros and cons to all different types of regulatory regimes. Ours is fragmented. We have the alphabet soup of regulators. Part of this has been seeing where the market evolves and then understanding where jurisdictional boundaries exist, right, identifying where there are gaps, and then, only then, might you get Congress's attention to say, oh, this is what's actually happening, and we realize this may not be the most effective and efficient way to be regulating a space. And that, unfortunately, takes time.
I mean, we're seeing in INX, which you can pull up the F1 online, it's an Israeli group that actually is looking at, number one, issuing a token to finance itself, and then also setting up exchanges. And the SEC effectively came back during the feedback that went on 20 months and said, even though you can take a token, the token can be a currency, a derivative, it can be a stock, and you can trade it all on the same platform. We don't want that because we don't want to be, we don't have jurisdiction over two of those three things. So we want to see this stuff compartmentalized so that, and you have to get your currency licenses, you're this license, you're that license, and we need these entities essentially segregated. And so I think that the guidance indirectly is coming through those documents, the way that if you actually look through them and how they're set up, you're going to see a heavy amount of re-engineering that you probably can't track, or maybe you can through Edgar, but you'll see where they ultimately ended up, and we're mirroring traditional regulatory structures in the country, and that's I think where at least in this country, where it's all going to evolve to very quickly.
Let's get to another question.
So I was just going to add, I mean, isn't the issue really that Bitcoin, etc., were designed to be currencies effectively, but they've been used for speculation? It's the point that we were talking about earlier, which is the intention of the token holder.
There's no issuer.
Yeah.
There's no company.
There's no, exactly, but they were designed to be an exchange of value, but actually no one's using them for exchange of value, or few people are using them for exchange of value, and actually you do bump into a lot of people who said, oh yeah, I developed the most expensive website in the world because, I got paid 10 Bitcoin for it, back in the day, right? So, it was originally designed to be an exchange of value and effectively like a currency without the central issuer, but it's become something that people hold because they think, because it's a speculation. So it's kind of moved, and that of course may change again, right?
It's a bit like the difference between gold and steel. So you're mining for gold, right? It just exists, so you have to go and get it. Where steel is something that you manufacture for a commercial purpose.
I want to make a point about regulators, just how to think about them. The SEC, because it's common stock and it's held as the most heavily politicized of all the regulators, and it's very difficult to be in that institution and to be forward-thinking and aggressive, because if you're not permissioned by Congress will haul the SEC chair or other people up to the Hill to testify, beat them about the ears with a figurative 2x4, and threaten to cut their budget. And so they tend to be very risk-averse. And one of the reasons why, and Commissioner Pierce alluded to this, I mean, the advantage of the Jobs Act was that it actually it actually pushed the SEC along. The things that were embedded in the Jobs Act could not have been done without a piece of legislation because it would have been too much political risk for the SEC to take that on. And so the legislative process, even many times, if you go back through and you look at the history with decimalization, there was a piece of legislation that was sponsored by Mike Oxley of Sarbanes-Oxley fame, and it never actually made it over to the Senate, but it passed at least the House Financial Services Committee almost unanimously, or pretty close to, and it permissioned Arthur Levitt to move down the path towards decimalization. And so, so I can't emphasize how important it is, this interplay between the legislative branch of the government and the Securities and Exchange Commission to at least de-risk a concept so that the SEC can then move forward and do their work.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that theme and kind of the original question too, which is we're in a place right now where I think the SEC in particular, but regulators in general, are putting this technology and these digital assets into boxes, and the players that are involved into boxes that are familiar and that are already created and functioning. So thinking about like transfer agents, not accepting blockchain as the instrument of record, but needing to kind of build in the ecosystem that is familiar into this new space. And in some ways, that's I think it's inefficient. I mean, that's blockchain was designed to alleviate some of those inefficiencies, and I think we're building them back in. And I think I agree with you that we are to a point where I think legislation is required to enable, and this is your point too, Tina, to enable the regulators to act, because in some cases they don't have that authority. The SEC is enforcing its authority that it has today.
So,
The Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance published a report about 3 months ago now. It's fabulous. I highly encourage you to download it. But they interviewed 23 different national regulators around sentiment, why they're taking the approach they're taking, what approach are they taking, what's the taxonomy that they're using. There's a bunch of gems in there. But the key takeaway is 70% of the agencies that they spoke to are retrofitting existing frameworks to, as you say, kind of square peg, round hole. Some of these things are forcing stuff into regimes because in some cases they don't necessarily understand the nuances, and in some cases they don't have regular or legislative purview to do anything else. But 70% globally, that's quite a high number. So
that's a really high number. So I think we ran out of time a few minutes ago. We have one more question. Okay, and then before you ask the question, though, I'm going to tell the panelists I was going to ask each of you to give like 15 to 30-second final statement. So while she's asking the question, you'll answer that question, but then give one last thought after that. But you can start thinking about it now. Go ahead.
I'm Carol Van Cleef with the Luminous Group, and hopefully they'll be listening to my question. It's been a great panel. I think you've highlighted well the different issues that we're up against. The United States has a particular history of the Congress really trying to leave as much to the regulators as possible and keep it off their plate. And we also have that rule, it's easier to block than it is to pass in terms of legislation. Interestingly enough, in the title being industry regulator or regulator industry collaboration, we haven't heard Libra come up at all. Is this a case study of how to do it or how not to do it? What can we learn from it? And do you think this may ultimately be a catalyst for that next stage of legislation that to date, I don't think the industry has been quite ready for, but it's really highlighted a lot of the weaknesses in our current system, both on the security side and on the currency side.
It's a really interesting situation, I think ever since that announcement, because it's really bringing onto the world stage, I mean, the U.S., the national stage and the global stage, questions that everyone in this room has probably been considering for years. Monetary effects of blockchain technology on monetary policy, currency, security, all these capital things. Controls. Exactly. And so, and so to see that now brought to such a global level, I think it presents extraordinary opportunities to address them. At the same time, significant risks that they may not be addressed appropriately based on, for all the reasons that we started out. The first question you asked, how do you engage with regulators? And so I think now more than ever, it's vitally important that we do engage with regulators, make sure they understand this industry. It includes a platform like Libra, but it includes so many more innovative technologies and companies and players, and so that we don't legislate reactively. And we already saw some of that with there was a draft bill in House Financial Services that to me was drafted fairly quickly, and we want to avoid, make sure that we have well drafted and
That's a very delicate way of saying that. As somebody who used to write those bills on congressional staff, that was very delicate, and I appreciate that.
I also think that there's the players involved, and so I think that there is probably a catch-22 situation of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If they had gone privately to regulators to socialize and sense check this versus the what I think was intended to be ultra transparency, putting it out for everybody to then take hits. And I know from a Facebook specific position, there's been a lot of questions around, well, Libra doesn't have a chief compliance officer, legal doesn't have a policy person, and they've said, well, if we put them in place, then you would have said that we're controlling it. And so, we've launched it so that Libra can hire their own team of staff, and now you're saying that we're not ready. So I do think it's a little bit of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But
they do have lobbyists.
Yeah, but I also think that what it is going to inspire, which would be fantastic, is more jurisdictions to actually progress some of their central bank digital currency projects. So for instance, in Europe, we've been looking at finality for 4 years, 5 years. I mean, I started working on that project years and years and years ago for literally intra-bank settlement. Like it's not even anything that would affect any of you, and it's like 5 years later, and it's still not right. Like that's crazy. That's inefficiency.
Yeah.
So I'll
One
try
last
to be
quick
brief
point.
on this. I think it's amazing what having a platform of 2 billion people does to catalyze interest. But here's why I think it actually does that and why it's an incredible case study. Is the 2 billion people who are on a platform, it's an internet-based platform. And it highlights that computers connect today. This isn't rocket science. You can send information, including information about value, in a pretty frictionless way across platforms. And so what this is doing is raising kind of every jurisdictional, whether regulatory or geographic jurisdictional question that could be raised, dealing with securities laws, dealing with commodities laws, dealing with how do you treat currency, what do you do about monetary policy, all of that is implicated because of what this represents. So I think it's actually a great case study that kind of flags all of the major issues that fintech, is going to continue forcing people to think about going forward.
Libra's terrifying.
Sounds like a good law review.
Libra's terrifying. I mean, if you're a regulator or you're heading the House Financial Services Committee, because with 2.4 billion monthly users, right? The scale of that and the ability when you're looking at a basket of fiat currencies potentially that then have to be purchased may displace, back to monetary policy, may displace to a large degree the dollar as a benchmark in many instances. And so what are the implications of that? I think they're profound.
Well,
Yeah, no, I agree.
But
And
it
I
isn't
think
2.4 billion users,
What?
and it isn't to disintermediate the dollar. So.
We're going to need to end it there. We went way over our time. And please thank our panelists for me. They were amazing.